Aboriginal people have lived in Greater Australia for over 50,000 years, leaving traces of their story everywhere they went. Through the last ice age, they survived the longest drought in human history, only to be faced by a new challenge. The planet started heating up. The sea level rose by over 130 meters, swallowing 1/4 of the continent. The Great Flood is a story of ingenious inventions, cultural explosions, conflicts, and new nations. The Great Flood is remembered by the Pitjantjatjara in the Warinyinyi dreaming.
People killing there. All of man will come. Killing them there. Ah. Can't see.
18,000 years ago on the Nullarbor, the rising sea began to flood the south of the continent. Up to 100 kilometers of land was lost every generation.
Raja? Raja? Kali aja lah. Nggak malu nyanyi nak ada cota tu.
Gua?
Angkat cuat.
The Warinyinyi, or Desert Finch dreaming, tells of the creation of the land and the people who live here. Many of the details are secret and sacred, so cannot be revealed. But the story of the Great Flood can be told.
Pudding aja nih. Pudding aja nih. Wow. Karena nggak ada yang udah. Ayah kau bilang ada nggak ada frank dah.
Gua?
Marco long way ini.
Gua?
Pipo, baca ulang kali jangan mendengar dan tahu ada. My father, my tamu, kayak ujung berbeda nothing.
Gua?
Apa ni? Kalau jangan perlu kali jangan live.
Gua in the ancient ancestry, ancient past.
Jangan dah. Ayah kau bilang ada ngantar frank kan? Yang tinggal kan? Agak pak.
In the dreaming story, the Warinyinyi, or Desert Finch ancestral beings, traveled from their homeland in the center of the continent to confront the Great Flood. The Warinyinyi bundled their spears together and dived into the water to form the cliffs of the Nullarbor. All the Warinyinyi drowned, but the ocean was stopped.
Macam jangan kuat bang.
Gua?
Nama bang. Iya. Munkara. Irit.
Gua?
Munkara mulap.
As an archaeologist, we know the sea was way out, beyond the horizon, right? Parari. And then slowly came in. And on the science, right, we know it started to come in 18,000 years ago, out there, and then it came up and up and up and up. Stopped. It stopped at 6,700 years ago, which means if the two stories are about the same thing, it's the oldest religious story in the world. Huh? What do you think about that? Kulini? Tell the story, tell the story. No school. School Murba. Tell the story, tell the story. Not make up Mularba and Jugurba. Jungu. Myth as history, myth as history. History, Mularba. Really one.
My father, Nana Samu,
Yeah, told them and educated. His grandfather. Listen to the law, listen to the law.
Stories about the Great Flood have been passed down for hundreds of generations all around Australia. In the northeast of the continent, Garngor, the seagull woman, pulled her raft backwards and forwards across the land to form the Wellesley Islands in the Gulf of Carpentaria. In South Australia, Nurrungeri sent a tidal wave in a rage to drown his wives, separating Kangaroo Island from the mainland. When the seas began to flood the northwest of the continent, Murujuga was still a series of hills above a plain. Here, the story of the Great Flood is etched in stone. Thousands of engravings show the remarkable adaptation to a totally different environment. The engravings from the period before the Great Flood are all land animals, especially the kangaroo.
And certainly here we have a lovely example of the kangaroo. This image would date from roughly 12,000 years ago. It's at a time when in Europe people were still running around in caves. You still hadn't invented agriculture. The pyramids are still 5,000 years away from being constructed. People were producing fantastic images on these rock surfaces across the archipelago.
Ken Mulvaney is working with the traditional owners of Murujuga, like Tyson Mowrin, to understand the effects rising seas had on his ancestors.
Here we're sitting amongst an interesting group of 4 kangaroos. All have a characteristic of lines that are actually cutting into the image of the kangaroo, most likely depicting hunting or a hunting magic.
This site clearly had great symbolic importance. Then, around 7,000 years ago, there came a profound change.
Over here, we have a fish that has been added. We've got the tail of the fish, the body coming around with one fin here, the head round here, second fin out that side back to the tail, and it's completely pecked in. Clearly it relates to a period after the sea levels got here. Roughly 7,000 years ago.
The first bloke who got the kangaroo, you know, they were real bush people. When the sea rose, you know, then those same people became closer to the sea, so then they started being sea people, eating more, having a lot more to do with the ocean.
As the seas came in, all the engravings changed to sea animals. They show a complete shift in diet and ways of hunting. These were sea people now, and they felt compelled to express that shift on some of the hardest rocks on Earth.
What's really nice is where you've got these turtles that have been engraved over the top of the kangaroo, and it really shows the time difference between the phases. So here we've got the large outline kangaroo, the tail there, hind leg, forelimbs there, pair of ears and his head in here, and then over the top you can see the turtle there and with the head.
Turtle on his head. You know, just imagine maybe as a young fella might have got their first turtle out on a hunting trip or something, you know, to feed their family. But those young fellas, you know, they must have been pretty proud to know that they maybe got their first kill or something, and they're stepping up and they're providing for their family, so, you know, they're recording that story. You can just imagine how good they would have felt.
Tyson's ancestors studied every ecological detail of the new sea animals, like the turtle. Here on this rock, they engraved the turtle's life cycle, relating it to the seasons of the year.
In this case, we have a mating turtle, and we can tell this. You see the double pairs of flippers, and over here, a rather small, presumably a juvenile turtle representing the hatchling or a young turtle. In this one, we have a turtle with this line, which presumably is the stabbing spear that they use for hunting turtles in this area. So we have a full sequence representing the life cycle of the turtle.
In the Kimberley, when the seas first began to rise, the monsoon set in. For the Wunnambulgambara people, this was a time of creation.
So one day, our great spirit took out from his halo the cloud and threw it up in the sky. Then the cloud grew bigger and bigger and bigger. Then the rain started to pour. And it created the land and the rivers and lakes and even the water holes that we have today.
Here, the warm and wet climate didn't just force changes in diet. Over 12,000 years ago, it gave rise to a spectacular flourishing of culture. The Wunnambulgambara created the earliest paintings of ceremony in the world, the Gwion figures. The Wunnambulgambara and a major archaeological team are piecing together this ancient cultural explosion. Middens are excavated to determine diet. Pigments are X-rayed to find out where the ochre used came from. But the greatest insights into life 12,000 years ago are found in the intricate details of the paintings themselves.
You can see here there's a bush yam. You can see it's like a bush potato there. A lot of food they carry.
This one is carrying where most people would call it dilla bag. Here you can see again, some got a bit of thing hanging down from the arm. They all got to be dancing this.
Albert, look at this. Look at the detail here. This figure here, I particularly like because you can see the hair's been pulled into tiny little pigtails or plaits, and you can actually see where it's been knotted at the end. But under the arms, there's more decorations coming down here, quite elaborate decorations. And the armlets go both round the arm, and then there's tufts going up. We think probably plant material would make those. And the pair of boomerangs in this hand. And if you follow this figure up, unfortunately a chip's fallen out of there. You can see an enormous headdress going back.
Sometimes they used to put bee wax on their head and make it stiff. And in the end, they make a little ball and they just pluck out an emu feather, wrap it around and just put it there just to decorate themselves.
You can see the boy reaching out to his father there. They are getting ready for ceremony, big corroboree.
Young boys become men.
It was as if the artist was saying, this boy's new life must be marked and celebrated with joy.
Imagine the headdresses as they danced around. Imagine the shapes, the twirling of all these different accoutrements.
All over the Kimberley, thousands of these elaborate celebrations of life are being rediscovered. It's increasingly clear this remote and rugged country supported a vast and rich culture.
The spirit is right here. This is where my grandfather camped, and all people, and the cave did.
Pretty amazing panel, isn't it?
You want to run it? You can flick the switch for me. This is the first time that a Guion panel's ever been X-rayed. So if you just flick that for me, Albert, back towards you. First time ever.
And what?
X-rays going in.
This is special. The old people left this here for us to see it, so we can show you guys and everybody else that was here in this cave right now, painting here and walking around, hunting.
The 61 giant Guion figures in this shelter show that hunting here was very good.
Each one of the figures have a slight paunch, but then they nip in at the waist. I think that the paunch might mean that the people were relatively well-fed, relatively affluent. There's probably something to say. There's not fat on too many hunter-gatherer groups, and I think that a bit of roundness might have been something that was admired.
The abundance in the art suggests that 12,000 years ago, there were plenty of resources for everyone.
Very rarely you get somebody holding a fighting position, but mostly people seem to be in a passive position. And it may be that the competition for resources, territoriality, wasn't so strong in those days, so there wasn't that tension. It was much more a coming together of people. It's amazing to think that this was painted thousands and thousands of years ago, and I can sit here today and get a glimpse of what their life was like. I mean, it's no history book will tell you that. This is, goes back much further than any history book can.
My people have been living here for thousands and thousands of years, from the dream time.
"800 kilometers to the east in Arnhem Land, another richly expressive culture emerged at precisely the same time.
There's so many figures in different poses. They're racing across the wall, tumbling, falling, some standing, and lots of material culture. So this figure is standing on one leg in that classic pose that often you see Aboriginal men in. And this one has 4 boomerangs, 3 in one hand, and the other one in a position ready to be thrown. And the legs are spread right out, suggesting that it's moving really fast, racing across the landscape.
The figures are so detailed and dynamic, they bring to life stories from 12,000 years ago.
This poor fellow has fallen to the ground, just lying prostrate with a spear right through the torso. But behind it is a figure that looks like it's racing in, flailing away with this boomerang, perhaps to give the coup de grace. If someone killed someone else, then there'd be payback from the family of the deceased. And maybe that's what's going on. This guy may have killed someone from the family of these people, and they're rushing to punish him. Here's a wonderful figure. What's really fascinating is these dashes coming out of the mouth. 2 streams of them, suggestive of sound, that the figure's speaking. And again, that adds to the animation, the liveliness of not only this particular design, but the whole panel. We have the earliest depictions of sound and motion, these amazing scenes of action, quite different from and earlier than this sort of art from any other part of the world. When we look at the rock art of Australia, we can see that particular styles run across very large regions. The dynamic figures, the Guion figures, are a form of high art. They're major cultural developments, and that suggests that there wasn't just a small population struggling for survival, but rather a fairly large group with a very sophisticated visual culture, ceremonial culture, spiritual culture that persisted for long periods of time in these regions.
These early stages of the Great Flood were times of immense creativity. In the Guion and dynamic art, we see for the first time one of the most ingenious inventions of the ancient past. The boomerang.
Well, what I have here is the oldest wooden boomerang in the world that we know of. It's 9,000 years old.
Wooden boomerangs decay quickly, but this ancient boomerang was preserved in a peat swamp in South Australia. It has the same aerodynamic contours of all boomerangs.
It's a plano-convex foil, airfoil, like an aeroplane wing. Flattened face under here, that's the plano element, and then the convex surface is the top surface. Air that, as it hits it, will flow smoothly over that surface. Now what that means is there's less pressure on the top, and that brings the boomerang up. That gives the lift. That's why the aeroplane rises off the tarmac.
Hunting boomerangs have been found in other parts of the world, but the returning boomerang is unique to Australia. It involves even more astounding physics.
The returning boomerang is an astonishing achievement. We don't know how it originated. We can only assume trial and error, and that people understood, first of all, that plano-convex form was something which could impart aerodynamic qualities. And then later, this observation that gyroscopic precession, as we know it today, could cause a boomerang to turn and come back. People could launch a boomerang 100 or 200 or even 300 metres on a good day and have it return to their hand. The returning boomerang, and this is from the Geelong area of Victoria, they were used in southeastern Australia and southwestern Australia primarily for hunting water birds. You could fly the boomerang above a flock of birds. It would hover before returning, and that would cause the water birds to think that a hawk was above them and they were in trouble. So they would fly down, and the hunters would hoist the net so the water birds would all fly into the net. So a very sophisticated choreography of hunting in which the returning boomerang is the central player.
Boomerangs were used across the mainland as a multi-purpose tool for butchering, for fighting, for making fire, and music. Yet, as the environment changed, the boomerang vanished from Arnhem Land.
Ah, what a view. This is a wonderful place to come to terms with why the boomerang disappeared in this part of the country. 10,000 years or more ago, this was all grassland. But today, it's covered with forest. This plain would have been very, very different. It would have been an ideal place to use a boomerang for hunting and bringing down kangaroos and emus and other mammals and birds. But once the climate changed and this became a wetter environment, all of this forest began to spring up, and the boomerang became less and less useful.
The tree branches got in the way of the boomerang, so the spear became more useful, especially when a technology was invented that increased its speed and accuracy. The spear thrower. The paintings of 10,000 years ago captured the moment of transition.
And this is a classic example of some of the changes that occur. The headdresses take different shapes and forms, and the material culture changes. So this figure is holding a boomerang, but near it are two spears, and next to the barbed spears is this object, a hooked stick oar, very early representation of a spear thrower. You can just see the little hook here. People would place the end of the spear in there, hold it above their shoulders with the barbed part of the spear facing out, and then the spear thrower could be used to very accurately fire the spear through the trees. Eventually, the boomerang disappears from the art completely, and when Europeans first arrived in Arnhem Land, in what's now Kakadu National Park, people did not have boomerangs at all.
By 8,000 years ago, the sea had risen over 100 meters, flooding the vast coastal plains of the north. Large groups of people were driven off their ancestral lands to seek higher ground. In the Kimberley, the graceful Gwions were replaced with rigid, well-armed figures.
They're fighting, I can tell.
Yeah?
You know how I can tell?
Yeah.
Because they have no dancing gear on.
All right.
No dancing gear. See, they're just fighting. If they was dancing and celebrating, you would have seen all the dancing stuff there. See? This one here, you got a spear. They all spearing one. You see that spear there? They have a fight. See it? That's the rumor there.
Yeah.
And the spear already left, see it? Right down to there.
Isn't that fantastic, eh?
It is.
They having fight. I don't know what they're fighting for, but they're having fight.
During this period, the paintings become increasingly stark, and the figures are more often seen carrying weapons, such as these bundles of barbed spears.
Why have we had a change from boomerangs and other more decorative elements to figures that are much stiffer and nearly always carry some of these different weapons? This might relate to a change in the environmental conditions, or it might relate to an increase in population where there was actually more stress on people and they had to compete for resources. So it might indicate that people were more interested in territoriality, and in those sorts of situations you often get a great influx of painting people, an effervescence of painting. So people mark territory more strongly.
To the south of New Guinea, the massive freshwater Lake Carpentaria was flooded by salt water. This drove entire populations of people up into the higher grounds of Arnhem Land.
Rising sea levels forced people inland into the Arnhem Land area that we know today, and they would have come in contact with the descendants of the people who made these dynamic figures. There must have been a period of readjustment where new relationships to land were worked out.
By 6,000 years ago, conflict over land reached the level of pitched battles between large groups of warriors.
The battle scenes in the rock art of Australia are mostly found in Western Arnhem Land. And indeed, we have the oldest battle scenes from anywhere in the world. There are a couple sites with simple figures arranged with spears and some boomerangs. One figure's holding a hafted stone axe, and they're in two groups opposed to each other. In one case, there's a crack in the rock that they're on either side of, with a few figures that have crossed over, and some of those figures are riddled with spears.
In Sydney, one man's skeleton tells the personal and macabre story of what happened when people fought over space.
And this is Narrabeen on the north side of Sydney, on the northern beaches.
In 2005, Gadigal elder Alan Madden and archaeologist Joe McDonald were called to this suburban street after human bones were discovered by gas workers.
This bus shelter is the site of Sydney's most extraordinary archaeological find in the last 20 years. We had a few people who were sitting here waiting for the bus for quite some time and said no wonder he died. That's what happens to a lot of people waiting for the buses on the northern beaches. The Narrabeen Man is the name that archaeologists in the Aboriginal community have given to the skeleton that was found here in 2005. He'd been speared in the stomach and the back and hit over the head with an axe, and is the first skeletal evidence in Australia that has conclusive archaeological evidence of having been ritually killed.
When we looked at this one, the thoughts had run through, let's get this fella out from where he is. I think any place would be more appropriate than laying under a bus shed. But also, we wanted to know more about who he was, where he was from.
Narrabeen Man's skeleton is held at Sydney University. Forensic pathologist Denise Donlan was also at the excavation.
I remember you commented at the time he looked like one of your murder victims because he was in fact lying in a position that was quite...
He wasn't in the sort of traditional position where the, flexed with the arms together and so on.
We actually found 4 or 5 of these spear barbs around his head, and then when we started to come down onto the body, we found more spear barbs around the rib cage. And then the one that really got us was the one that was actually lodged in this vertebra here. Is L1 or is it
L3? L3. Lumbar 3 it is.
Yeah.
That would have taken a lot of force.
Yes, it would have.
Now, to take a lot of force, it wouldn't have been thrown from a distance, do you reckon? Or would it have been up close and personal when they've just run it through him?
When people are being punished, they didn't stand a long way away, and they were often surrounded by all the people who were in the punishment squad. And so he would have been probably trapped, and he would have had people throwing things at him from perhaps a circle of people around him.
Detailed forensic work revealed that Narrabeen Man was over 6 feet tall with strong muscles, probably in his early 30s. There's intriguing evidence that he wasn't a local, but a visiting warrior. In Sydney, a front tooth was knocked out at initiation.
The suggestion was he's maybe 30 to 40 years old.
Yes.
He would have went through initiation a long time before then.
During adolescence.
And this guy's got
all his teeth.
teeth.
So given that he had both of his front teeth, we were interested in whether he was in fact from Sydney or whether in fact he'd been killed because he was from somewhere else. The oxygen isotope analysis that's been done proved absolutely that he's a coastal man, that he spent most of his life eating fish and shellfish.
He's a coastal man, so whether he come from the north, down south, or come from the south, I'd say he's done something terrible wrong here.
And so the question that archaeologists have asked is whether all those people who used to live on the coastal plain who were pushed up into Sydney were trying to renegotiate space. So the fact that he has got backed artefacts lodged in his body, the fact that the sea level was slightly higher than it had been possibly in the preceding 1,000 years, really suggests that there's a lot of social pressure happening in Sydney at that time and that he's basically a logical conclusion of what happens when people get into disputation about their space and about where they're living and who's allowed to live where.
Over 130 metres of rising sea had transformed Sydney from a river valley into a harbour full of resources. Within the new and strictly defined territories, different nations began to flourish.
Where we are today is the land of the Gadigal people. This would have been a lot of timber around this way, shrubs, beaches. It would have been like a Garden of Eden to Aboriginal people here. This would have been like a Woolworths. You know, this would have been your fish market here, your fruit and veggies, your meat market at the back. You could just imagine the canoes that would have been on the harbour here fishing. The women would have been in there with the kids. And one of the things that would have stood out there would have been fire in the canoes.
People had their defined territorial areas, and they had all the resources they need. They had water, they had all the animals that would come into that water. They had shellfish all the way around the edge of the harbour. They had all the fish in the harbour. And I think it was an extraordinarily well provisioned area for people to live, and I think that's one reason why we have archaeological sites still surviving here as evidence for that.
There are over 3,000 rock art sites in the Sydney Basin. More Indigenous art than any other city in the world. These engravings open a window into the ways cultural groups changed over time and increasingly differed from one another.
The whole site seems to be like a family gathering.
Here we have a couple, a man and a woman, that are standing next to each other, and they're surrounded by the types of material culture items that they would have taken with them on the hunt. So the man is here, he's larger than the woman, and he's holding some sort of club under his arm. And in that hand, he's got a very large boomerang. And the woman has just one item next to her, and that's a basket. She's actually holding like a dilly bag next to her left arm.
At this time of high population around the harbour, men and women developed different ways of hunting and gathering.
We know that the people in Sydney had what we call a dual social system, and the women went off and did their stuff during the day. Women would go out 4 miles off their heads in a canoe with another woman, maybe with the baby as well, with their little fire in the bottom so they could fish. And they were incredibly independent. Men went off on their own hunts, and they looked for kangaroos on these ridge tops, but they also fished with spears. Then one assumes everybody brought the food back at the end of the day, and they would all camp together, and the family would share the food.
There is a family structure. The clan was your family. In-laws, outlaws, brothers, sisters, aunties, uncles and that. That was your mob. That was your clan.
In all, there were 34 clans in the Sydney region making up 3 nations. Everywhere, the Great Flood forged increasingly diverse cultures. Perhaps none more distinct than the Tasmanians, cut off from the rest of the continent 14,000 years ago.
This the severance of the Bass Strait Islands and Tasmania from the mainland began one of the longest periods of isolation of any human group on the planet. What happens to a group of people who are isolated for this length of time 10,000 to 14,000 years ago?
For the people of Flinders Island in the newly formed Bass Strait, life was good at first. The Great Flood brought them some of the richest marine life in the world.
So it would have been the men or the women? Of this?
Women.
Women,
Yeah. I done all the diving for crays and abs, you know, because they're in deeper water.
Yep.
And, well, maybe seals, you know, because this was a good place for seals.
Yeah. They're quite a way out, those rocks, too.
Yeah.
They're quite about 300 metres offshore.
Yeah, well, they were, like, very good divers, so...
Yeah. And I believe they mimic the seals as
Yeah,
well.
yes. Put oil and that on the bodies and went up on the rocks and hid and they come up and I give them a tap.
Yeah.
Look at them, mate.
Yeah, there's one.
We've got the Wariners. Beautiful to eat. Is it them? Some oysters. That's an abalone. They're found on all the middens here on the east coast, down the west coast, all over Tassie, and there's a few here. Oh, they're beautiful eating.
Surface there, so there's a bit of charcoal. Some charcoal there. It's like fire, obviously. Another bit of charcoal here. Look here. A sort of halves. See all the burnt rocks?
Yep.
And this, is in situ. Like it's in this horizon, which is maybe somebody's come up from the beach and come up onto this high rise and just sat here and made a little fire and had a meal of these mussels. You can see the burning as well on these rocks. So this might have been quite a large cluster. You know, some people foraging in the past down on the rock platform, bringing up the mussels.
It would have been good because, you know, there's plenty of resources out there with the women out there getting all the shellfish and like, bringing them back to camp, talking to the kids, teaching the kids, you know, doing ceremony, educating the kids. You know, like, yeah, so it would have been a very ideal lifestyle, you know, like, very nice.
Yeah.
But these campfires were a kind of Last Supper. Suddenly, 7,000 years ago, people disappeared without a trace.
These hearths represent perhaps the last people on this island, and that is a similar pattern that we find throughout these islands, that a lot of the dates that we get are around about 7,000 to 8,000 years ago. That's the youngest sort of dates we have. After that time, that was it. They went elsewhere.
As the seas continued to rise, people would have seen the Tasmanian mainland get further and further away. The Bass Strait Islands were simply not big enough to sustain a viable population. People had to make the decision, either stay and perish or move to Tasmania.
When I retired, me and my two brothers used to come in camp, go diving here and go fishing here too, so...
Fantastic.
Yeah, that was before I knew anything about archaeology, you know, but it was just a perfect spot to stay. But great diving there, easy to get,
What do we got here? Warrener?
Quilts.
Abalone?
Abs. We have shiny ones, of course.
Yep. What about, the limpets? These little
limpets, yeah.
ones there?
There's tools on the ground, or artefacts on the ground, you know?
Yeah.
The caves at Rocky Cape were occupied right through the Great Flood. Dense shell middens found all around Tasmania show that people were living well. But then 1,000 years of isolation resulted in big differences with people on the mainland. The Tasmanian toolkit was one of the smallest in the world. Only 22 items. On the mainland, people had around 120 items. The boomerang, spear thrower, afton axe, and wooden shield, to name a few. The Tasmanians had none of these. Their kit included the waddy, or wooden club, and spear, stone tools, along with woven and kelp bags.
We have a list of material possessions that allowed people to survive in a very changing environment and allowed them to develop a culture and a society which was just as rich as any other hunting and gathering societies. These people were not in any way under any selective pressure. They knew exactly what they were doing. It doesn't need to be composite and complicated. They use fire and cooperative hunting to achieve the same ends. And so having a society in collaboration and cooperation is technology in action. But it begs the question, is this the minimum amount you need to survive and have a healthy, happy and sustainable life amongst your people?
It is a challenging view for Europeans brought up on ideas of progress through technology.
In Europe, there was many ideas about the horse-drawn cart, the wheel, the invention of metallurgy, and a sense that people were progressing, going somewhere. And I think this had a great impact on the way in which we think about progress, that it's expected that people progress through material culture.
Yet the Tasmanians worked less than the average European and had more time to devote to cultural pursuits.
So I think it was a perfect way, perfect way of living. They were what they needed to survive, and it worked for 10,000 years, and maybe that's a good lesson to learn these days too, where we don't need all this material culture to survive, we don't.
It may be that this is the true lesson that we can learn from the Tasmanian Aboriginal people, that a minimum amount of material possessions propels you successfully into the future as a viable population of people. And let's face it, they survived for 10,000 years in isolation. And that's extraordinary.
And I think that we'll be here for another 10,000 years or more. If the Earth doesn't blow up or something,
By the time the Great Flood ended 5,000 years ago, 1/4 of the continent had disappeared underwater. Hundreds of new nations were created through the remarkable intellectual creativity of the first Australians. Over the next 5,000 years, this creativity took a further giant leap. When much of the world embraced agriculture, people here chose instead a sophisticated system of fire stick farming and careful management of the land to sustainably increase its bounty. The first Australians achieved something unique in human history. They transformed an entire continent into the biggest estate on Earth.
Next week, they transformed an entire continent into a fully sustainable huge estate until outsiders arrived. First footprints. Next, leading art critic Andrew Graham Dixon crosses the Atlantic to discover the art of America.